Hello, welcome to AT&T ThreatTraq for June 29th, 2016. This program provides network security highlights, discussion, and countermeasures for cyber threats. Today we're joined online by Jim Clausing. Welcome, Jim.
Hey, how's it going?
Doing well, thanks. And I understand you're all dressed up ready for the holiday coming up.
Absolutely.
All right, very good. We have joining us here Joe Harten. Welcome, Joe. Glad to have you back. And Michael Singer. Welcome,
Hello,
Michael.
Brian. Glad to be here.
All right, I'm Brian Rexroad, and we're going to go first to you, Jim. And, I guess we wouldn't have a complete program, if we didn't have some sort of an arbitrary execution bug. So give us the scoop.
Yeah, this is one that came to my attention a couple days ago. Some researchers at Cisco discovered a vulnerability in libarchive. Libarchive was actually originally developed in about 2004 for FreeBSD. It was first released in FreeBSD 5.3, but has since been picked up by a number of other packages. It's widely used in FreeBSD, NetBSD, but it's also been picked up in a number of Linux distributions as well, in things like the Nautilus file browser, for those of you who use Debian or Ubuntu, the file browser that lets you, graphically click into different file systems, look at the folders and so forth. It's also used in a number of other packages that are used to open up various archive formats, tar and CPIO and that kind of thing. There are a number of packages out there designed to handle a lot of them, to open all your zip files and your tar archives and your CPIO archives, and a number of those use libarchive as well. The Linux distros and FreeBSD and NetBSD will be, or have already, pushed out updates, but this is another one of those kind of odd ones where you don't normally think about the programs that open up your archives as being a potential target of attack. This potentially could have. There were actually 3 different vulnerabilities that the guys at Cisco discussed. One of them was handling 7-zip format files. Be on the lookout for updates to your libarchive libraries. And if you've used it in any utilities that you statically compiled, you'll need to recompile those.
So there are perhaps a couple of areas where we could dig into this just a little bit further. I think, first of all, kind of recognizing that I think any program or any code that basically parses data is potentially subject to some sort of remote code execution or an arbitrary code execution bug, assuming the vulnerability is there. I mean, we have to sort of assume the vulnerability is there, and it's really a matter of knowing about it. And, kind of considering that as a part of designs of systems, that is, do you have control of the data that's being parsed? And I assume in this case, this is a case where you'd have to be given a maliciously crafted archive file as opposed to being concerned about data that's within a file that you archived. Is that
right? Yeah, because it's buffer overflows or heap overflows in the parsing. So yeah, it would require a maliciously crafted archive.
Well, it just shows you too that the use of shared libraries like this is sort of like a distribution channel that you don't normally think of. That developers all share libraries. So a corrupted library is a good way to get at a lot of different pieces of code. So it's a little out of the box.
Well, that's very good. That was actually the next point I was going to, maybe a little bit of a variation on your point, is that if you're using basically a distribution channel or a package, like if you have a Linux distribution and this is part of that, then you would naturally be getting the updates as a part of that distribution, which is a good thing. So you automatically get the updates as the patches come out. But if you go directly to the source code repository that's available, you really have to be paying attention to that source code repository and any updates that come about, because in that case, you're on your own. Right. And you really have to be considering what the patch lifecycle maintenance is going to be for anything where you go to an independent path. And perhaps an extension on that, this is a case where it's a vulnerability, but you also need to consider, is there something that could be deliberately corrupting that distribution, and how would you protect yourself from that?
Yeah, a lot of times it's stuff that's being copied from one branch to another, or from one subcomponent to another, so it's not, like you said, the ideal case is where you're going direct, you're getting public updates, but when you're in this sort of sharing a library, sharing a code snippets, you kind of open the door to this sort of thing where you're using, less than the latest version of things. We see the same thing with Flash and, other shared components. So it's
yeah, but on the other hand, I think you're better off using a shared library that is getting some attention than trying to write your own one-off for every format that comes along. One last thing to point out, the same researcher was the one who in May discovered a vulnerability in 7-zip, which I know those of us that do malware research, that's our favorite archive tool, and we pass around a lot of our samples using 7-zip, but a lot of us had been stuck on 7-zip 9.20, which had been out there since 2010. So if you are using 7-zip, hopefully you've upgraded to 16.02, which is the one came out in May that doesn't have the vulnerabilities.
Okay, good recommendation there. And perhaps some good lessons to learn. And Michael, there's no better way to learn than to learn by example. Of course, maybe the best way is to learn by listening to our parents, but maybe the second best way is to learn by example. So I think you have a good example here.
Yeah. So we're constantly trying to educate our workforce so that they have cyber sense, I've once called it, right? So that they're sharp, they can spot stuff. We have an internal team that's focused on it to do a great job. I saw something out there just announced. It was a European antivirus company, AVG, that kind of explained this. And someone went through a lot of effort to teach people lessons. And they're telling them, watch where you go on the internet. Don't go to sketchy sites. And when they do, and when they get infected with this particular piece of malware, it does what a lot of the current malware does, that encrypts your files. Usually it's ransomware, and you want them to pay to get the key. This particular author of this piece of malware is just teaching them a lesson, but they follow that exact same path, and they say, okay, I've encrypted your files, you need a key, here's how you get the key. There's even kind of a little gaming where they hide a text file on their machine and tell them to go find it. When the story broke, it actually had the key in the story. So if you don't find it, you have that option as well. But I was fascinated that someone would go through that much trouble to teach a lesson. And I think it probably crosses a few lines, too, in the average teaching model that we would have.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I was going to bring it up as a word of caution that if you're going to go through some sort of an exercise, be careful how potentially disruptive it could be to somebody, meeting a deadline or, doing something that might really have some business critical application, and, could get some folks a little bit rattled. You don't want to be rattling people. You really want to be just teaching the lesson and make it a positive experience as much as possible, right?
Right. It's conceivable that if everyone who was affected by this counted up their hours of labor and went after you, it could be a pretty big suit against the person who's teaching in this case. Yeah. It also made me think way back to the 2003 Nazi worm, where someone said, I'm going to do everybody on the internet a favor. I'm going to write a worm that gets rid of the last big worm, which was Blaster, and then patches their Microsoft system. And what happened, I think, in a lot of networks was if all the systems try to patch at the same time, you have link saturation and a lot of issues and downtime. So you have to be very careful about just deciding to do things across the internet to other people's machines, and it can cause all kinds of issues.
Yeah, absolutely true. I think we've theorized that the Nazi worm was in fact an intent to go and repair things, And I think fundamentally it just had a bug in it. And I think it had to do with the way it did address scanning, and it went beyond where it was supposed to do, and it also started sort of at the same place each time, and so it created a whole lot of network noise that was far and above what Blasterworm created in terms of network noise, and it eventually did expire itself, so that was a good thing. But that's again, I think one of the hazards is the deeper you go into teaching by example. If there were some sort of a bug in this example that caused, in certain circumstances it wouldn't be able to decrypt or something, and then what do you do? So there are some hazards associated with it, and you really need to be pretty careful about it. And we were talking a little bit earlier, I think the only other real example that, kind of going back on the Nazi, I am only aware of really one other example, and I've forgotten the name of the botnet, but it was one where I think it was intended to, it was actually publicized that they were trying to go out and capture, like these IoT devices that are vulnerable and they're getting recruited into botnets, and just kind of, I wouldn't say hold them hostage, but hold them, protect them from getting infected by other botnets. But the problem is with a lot of these devices, you turn it off and it resets back into its vulnerable state. And so I think what we're starting to see is kind of a race. That is, can the bad guys get to the newly vulnerable device before the good guys are trying to protect it? So I haven't seen any evidence that that protective botnet has been particularly effective, but it is another sort of potential avenue here. So very interesting story. I think educational tools are an important part of our repertoire of what we do for security. Absolutely. So with this one, I'm always up for a cool idea. I couldn't help but say this, Jim, but in fact, covert channels actually are kind of a little bit of I can't say that I've studied it a lot, but it's a little bit of a passion to me, because I think it is really, you tend to run into some really cool concepts and things that you really force you to think outside the box. So tell us how you can get data outside the box here.
Yeah, well, this one, I first came across an article on Sophos's Naked Security blog, but then I went and got the paper from some researchers in Israel from Ben Gurion University. Mm-hmm. This one was kind of interesting. They described what they call fansmitter as a way of exfiltrating data from air-gapped computers by playing with the speed of the fan. Mm-hmm. Since fans in most modern computers are controllable by the computer itself, anybody who's ever had a desktop computer or a laptop with a fan in it knows when it gets hot and the fan speeds up, there's a noticeable difference in the way it sounds. Mm-hmm. And so these guys developed what they called SMC kit, which could tweak the speed of the fans to exfiltrate data. Mm-hmm. Now, it's not very quick. They were talking about something on the order of 15 bits per minute that could be transmitted. So this isn't going to be something that you're going to use to exfiltrate a large database with credit card numbers in it or anything. But it was an interesting idea, and mm-hmm. the paper itself goes into a lot more technical detail. But one of the in the Sophos blog, one of their concluding comments was, if you're worried about your fans being used as a secret signaling system, consider buying a fanless computer, like mm-hmm. a 12-inch MacBook.
Yeah, absolutely. I try to I try to encourage my kids to pay attention to everything, and this is particularly true, I think, when you start learning to drive, and perhaps even before you learn to drive, because it's even better. Is recognize what a car should sound like. Recognize any changes. Is there a new squeak? Is there a new rattle? Those are signs of things that you should be paying attention to. I think if you hear your fan speeding up and slowing down all the time, that should be something you should be paying attention to.
Usually means your hard drive's going to go, right?
Yeah, it usually means your hard drive's about ready to go.
Yeah.
So, this, I can't imagine that this could potentially be, sending any reasonable amount of data and you not really kind of notice that this fan's speeding up and slowing down. But I think perhaps back to the point, I'll date myself for a moment. We used to talk about covert channels in the context of mainframe computers. And, you wanted to be able to separate between accounts. It was the user accounts. But I guess one of the potential vulnerable points is that only one user could access the tape drive at a time. So if you could get use a signal that is to take control of the tape drive and then have another sort of covert thing that could see if the tape drive had been taken, and you could use that as a covert channel, release and take and release and take. So that was another example of a covert channel. And there's so many opportunities for covert channels now, it's almost unfathomable how many there are. And I think it's a very important, sort of concept to keep in mind that when we look at systems to consider what covert channels can exist. So, for example, we tend to think of a firewall as a means to be able to control access in or out of the network. But if you can simply use some kind of a resource control to be able to leave a signal that it doesn't have to actually go through, you can do some things like that. So I think that's one of the things that's kind of something to keep in the back of your mind, designing systems or considering what potential channels might exist, just to make sure that we're not being presumptuous about the security of a system.
Yeah, well, we've heard recently about advertisers trying to use cell phones to listen to, inaudible signals so they can gather data on, what ads folks are watching on TVs that aren't necessarily connected.
Mm-hmm.
This just seems to be another step in that kind of a thing.
Right, using the camera on your monitor and turning it around on you, all those things.
Mm-hmm. Yep, absolutely. So, all right, very good. Very much a theoretical discussion, but I think it's one that really I think is good for thought and considering how systems could be abused in ways that we hadn't otherwise imagined. So, Joe, I guess perhaps on a little bit more of a conventional breach story here.
So, the LinkedIn breach it's kind of old in two different ways. The press on it came out in May, and the original attack was actually in 2012. But just this week, the researchers at KoreLogic actually published some statistics that they were able to do after crunching some compute on the hashed information that was released. So, this is something that happened previously. But to give the backstory on it, in May, a hacker tried to sell the full list of LinkedIn breached information, and it came out to about 117 million usernames and passwords. Mm-hmm. And the hackers were trying to sell it on the dark web for 5 Bitcoin, which comes out to about $2,200. And at that point, that's when LinkedIn started taking it seriously, that they kind of underestimated how many passwords and usernames they admitted to losing. So they recognized it, and then eventually they sort of re-emailed their users and said, you really should change your passwords. Mm-hmm. But the folks at KoreLogic, they cracked 65% of the full list in 2 hours. They found it to be about 164 million unique email addresses and 177 million passwords, which is interesting because they don't match. Mm-hmm. So that does tell me that the folks at LinkedIn at least probably did have these stored separately, so you would have to do a little bit of engineering to match the two, but I'm sure that's something that a good hacker community can do. Mm-hmm. Passwords were encrypted with SHA-1, and they had no salt, which is random digits attached to the end of the hashes, so they're not stored and that well encrypted.
They're obscured.
Yeah, right. That's probably a better term for it. And a few interesting stats that, some of it's not surprising. The top passwords were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, LinkedIn, and password. Not quite as creative as what we saw with the Dolly Madison information, but sort of predictable.
Yeah.
The top email domains were Gmail and Hotmail. I thought it was interesting that 48% of the passwords were lowercase with one number. which you wouldn't think. At least maybe it does show a little progress in people's passwords. Also, more passwords were 8 characters or more than were 7 or fewer. So it maybe does show a trend towards longer passwords and slightly more complex passwords. Although only 1% of passwords had all of uppercase, lowercase, a number, and a special character. So not great password strength, but probably not as weak as we would have seen a few years ago. And then standard lessons here: don't store your passwords insecurely. If you're a website or a big provider that has the need to have users with passwords, I would say, if possible, don't store them at all. Let users be responsible for their passwords. And then on the user end, don't reuse your passwords, because anything that you had that was lost in LinkedIn, if you use that for your bank account or your any sort of critical other information, now you have to be worried about that. So
Absolutely. Go ahead.
And I'm reminded about something Michael said in last week's show, is just expect this to be the norm. This is, people's sort of tolerance for this is gone up. Nobody's shocked that, millions of passwords are lost anymore, and it's sort of become the expectation. So, that's just, unfortunately, that people are a lot more accepting of this than probably we would like.
So on this one, I'll work backwards. Your point about don't use reuse passwords. I think there's been a whole flurry of notifications that have been going out from other organizations, basically indicating that they're seeing password reuse being used to victimize their accounts. And so I don't know if it's from this data or from other sources of data or just a combination of all those things, but there have been a number of organizations that have made those notifications lately. And so it is certainly something to pay attention to, is to try to have uniqueness between systems. And the only way that I've found really as a practical means, you have to have some way to keep track of your user accounts on the various systems and things like that, and control those things. I guess the next topic that I'd like to consider in cases like this is, what do you have at risk if your LinkedIn password in this particular case were to be stolen? Somebody gains access to your account. The way I tend to look at it is, if you're on basically a social media site, anything you put on there about yourself is basically public domain information at that point. Right. So it's not as if you're losing information. I think the real risk is, as you mentioned, the password reuse issue, that is, can information about your account here be used to gain access to something else? And then the second aspect that I tend to think of it is, how could your account be used to try to victimize others? Can they be used? Can somebody else be social engineered through what appears to be a legitimate message from you to share some piece of information that might be able to make a victim out of those folks? And I think that's really the sense of responsibility.
The association of you with your employer. Potentially, we're looking at targeted phishing or targeted social engineering because of that level of information being out there.
That's true with anything you put in the public domain.
Yeah.
The observation for me was that we're telling people not to reuse passwords, and clearly the people who used LinkedIn for their LinkedIn password don't use that as their password everywhere else. I'm guessing they use Facebook for their Facebook password.
We're not positive about that, but that is a pretty good conclusion to come to.
And I would say the worst place to use LinkedIn for your password is LinkedIn.
So you should use LinkedIn for your password on Facebook, and Facebook for your password on LinkedIn.
That's probably not a good idea.
No?
But it's not as bad as using LinkedIn as your LinkedIn password.
Yeah.
Or the guy who uses just password everywhere.
Exactly.
Yeah,
That's probably not so good.
That's probably a bad choice. Go ahead, Jim.
Well, it's probably time for me to go take a look at the passwords we've been seeing in our honeypots again. So maybe sometime in the next couple of weeks I'll do that on the show again. But a couple of the other things that struck me there: storing the passwords with not salting the hashes, and using SHA-1. If you're going to use something that is computationally more expensive so that you can slow down the password cracking. Use something like PBK DF2 or something that's specifically designed for passwords that causes anybody who's trying to crack them to have to expend a lot more computational resources on it than something like SHA-1.
That's a good point, Jim. I think perhaps lost on, in fact, I can't remember the last time I really had had any conversation about this, but for cryptographic algorithms, hashes as well as cryptographic, encryption algorithms, the tendency is to think about how little computation you can do to be able to accomplish it, so you can do it very quickly under normal circumstances. But this is, in fact, an example where entering passwords is a relatively infrequent function, and it happens at human speed. You don't need computer speed to do password validation. And so to have an expensive computation function for password validation is actually a very good thing, because in the case where they're trying to crack it, they're trying to guess piles of different passwords against that computation. You just want to at least make it aggravating at the very least, right? I'll take that as an agreement. It's a little hard to see your
Sorry,
nod.
you couldn't see me nodding.
All right, very good. So we'll go to the next story here, and this was one I just couldn't help but cover. The headline here is "Large CCTV Botnet Leveraged in DDoS Attacks." This is a blog from security.net. This actually got a lot of basically repeat press. I saw in something, I think, in Network World. I saw some, anyway, there were a number of other organizations that basically reposted this in a variety of ways. So just to sort of summarize the article as they described it, first of all, this is an organization that does mitigation of denial of service attacks. And but what raised their attention to this one was the intensity and the duration of the attack. That is, it continued for hours and then actually turned into days that this attack basically took on. And the intensity here, they were looking at basically what was described as a layer 7 attack, which has a lot of sort of nuances or definitions. In particular, it was an HTTP flood. Typically, that's a case where somebody is sending a request to a website and expecting a response from it. What they're trying to do is send a request that is expensive for the website to basically respond to. So what they'll tend to do is maybe look for a big, huge document that to download and send the request to the site, and they don't really care that they actually get the document, but they're going to ask for it over and over and over again, things like that. And the other little trick that apparently they were doing in this case is what they call caching bypass, which is a case where they put a little nuanced change into the request each time, so that if you are doing caching, if you have basically a content distribution service, it forces that content distribution service to go back to the origination point and find out, and basically ask the origination point for the data. Nevertheless, in this case, they were generating close to 35,000 HTTP requests per second. And then once they started doing mitigation work, it increased to almost 50,000 HTTP requests per second. Now, that's fairly typical. The attacker is going to send some resources at a target. They're going to see if it's effective, and then if it turns out to be not effective, what are they going to do? They're going to try to send some more resources at the attack if they can. So that's not a really surprising aspect of this, although certainly 50,000 HTTP requests per second is it's a formidable number of requests. Now, if you were to try to look at this, now one of the things that they pointed out in this article is that there were a total of about 25,513 unique IP addresses that they basically identified in a couple of hours of the attack activity. That's a pretty significant number. But then if you divide that across the 50,000 requests per second, that's only like 1 or 2 requests per source per second. So it doesn't sound like they're really necessarily, each of those sources were working all that particularly hard. So just an observation in the data that was provided there. But was, kind of caught my interest in particular was it leveraged only CCTV cameras. Now, this is closed circuit television cameras, devices, DVRs, as a part of the attack activity. And so they talked a little bit about, I guess they did some probing to be able to see that these devices and what types of devices were used here. And we'll show that in a graphic in a moment here. And then they also sort of speculated incorrectly in my opinion, about what exploit was used against these devices. I think there was some sort of a vulnerability that was described I think it's fundamentally that a lot of these devices, most of these devices have telnet exposed to the internet, and they have default passwords on them that have been used. And so we've been reporting on this over and over again, that these devices are getting scanned for and compromised. So, some advice from the author here. If you have an online camera, or you're a vendor of online cameras, make sure that devices are fully patched and isolated from the internet. I recommend not exposing telnet to the internet, and don't have a default password that's, default across all devices. More modern devices, better protected devices have perhaps a password that's unique to the device, and it's printed in on the label or something like that, much like a serial number is. And then any device that does have internet access, make sure that they're locked down. That includes, DNS resolvers, NTP resolvers, or servers, and that sort of thing. So, nevertheless, the types of devices that they saw here, and based on the signatures they saw, was first and foremost the thing that was identified as the H.264 DVR. H.264 being basically the ISO standard for the encoding format. And then there were some others that really kind of identified some brand names associated with it. A lot of these devices have very similar characteristics in terms of their form and function. So I just took a chance, or an opportunity to query on Shodan. If you're not already familiar with Shodan, it is basically a service that you can go to see what types of devices are on the internet. It's really designed to kind of sort of take an inventory of the internet. So I queried for H.264 DVR, basically found a country distribution of devices in the order of about 100,000 in Brazil, Vietnam, Taiwan. Not surprisingly, some of these countries showed up in the list of countries that were source of the attack activity that were described in that article. So very consistent with that. So I'm going to use that as basically the segue into our internet weather report, and then first and foremost on the top most probed ports, we see port 23 TCP. Again, these are the security surveillance camera DVRs. I'll go off on a tangent for a minute. I happen to notice in some of the commentary for this article, there was scrutiny about whether these were actually closed circuit televisions because they're connected to the internet. That means not closed circuit.
Open.
Yeah, open. I think the CCTV is actually kind of referring to between the DVR box itself and the cameras, it's closed circuit. They're coaxes that go out to those cameras. But nevertheless, the DVR itself is actually connected to the internet so that you can view the cameras from the internet or manipulate it, things like that. And unfortunately, in this case, be able to exploit those as well. But kind of back to the point. Top of the list, port 23 TCP, a lot of scanning activity there. We're going to take a closer look at that, followed by port 22 TCP, that's SSH. We'll take a look at that one as well. Not as exciting. Third one, 53413 UDP, that's that backdoor for Netis brand home routers. Some activity there, but it is curbing off, and so that's an encouraging sign perhaps. We'll talk about that a little bit. Other ports that are showing up here, 443 TCP, 80 TCP, no surprises there. 3389 TCP, all of those are fairly stable in terms of the amount of activity that we're seeing. 3389 being remote desktop protocol, followed by 445 TCP. 465 TCP, that's actually research activity looking for SMTP servers. That happens to be the port for SSL encrypted SMTP servers. And then 53 UDP and 123 UDP, that's DNS and NTP scanning activity. To the point earlier, those get used in reflective denial of service attacks. And so we want to make sure those get locked down. Looking at the top 10 most sources doing the probing, yeah, I'm not going to use the word that you described earlier, Jim. I'm going to just say here this is bordering on ridiculous, or actually perhaps beyond ridiculous. I think at 50% we hit ridiculous. Nevertheless, we're just a little short of 75% of the sources that are doing scanning activity showing up in port 23 TCP. By the way, just to put it in real numbers here, in our data, that's nearly 810,000 unique source addresses that we saw through the course of the day on June 28th. And you can see, relatively speaking, the distribution of the other sources that are doing that scanning activity. Next in line being 445 TCP, that is latent configure infections that are out there on the internet. the 53413, 80 TCP, and then there are a couple of others that are associated with peer-to-peer activity that tend to show up in the data. And then last but not least, there are 4028 TCP. I don't recall specifically what that is, but that happens to be, I'll call it innocuous research activity that's taking place. So looking at the activity over the last 180 days for port 23 TCP, top graph is showing the number of probes. We're not at the peak of what we've seen, but in terms of the number of probes, we're still up very high, approaching on the order of 1 billion probes per hour in the data that we're showing. That is only showing basically a portion of the total network traffic. So there's actually many multiples that are actually taking place beyond that. And then in terms of the number of sources that are scanning, just a little off the peak there, but over the last couple of weeks, it really has been the highest that we have ever seen in a given hour in the 300,000 unique sources range in a given hour.
So Brian, like John Hogaboom mentioned on the last week's show, that a lot of times we'll see the trend in activity before something will come out in the community, in the news. Do you think this is the type of change in activity that will result in some sort of announcement, in the future sometime, or?
Well, I think the word is out. I mean, there's no question that the word is out. The question becomes what is actually going to be able to be done about this. And I think that's one of the things that any organization that's aware of this is kind of struggling with right now. Ultimately, there really is no easy fix for this. Generally speaking, the folks that are purchasing these things, they don't realize that they're computers. They don't think about them as computers. They're not thinking about patching them as computers. They don't realize that Telnet is exposed to the internet. And even if you kind of call them up and notify them, they're kind of, well, what am I supposed to do about it? And really the recommendation that I would tend to have is take that device and throw it in the trash and get one that's got more quality attributes. But there isn't really even a certification program that exists today to say this one is secure and that one's not. And so it really requires that the individuals, and these are folks that are running like a convenience store or something, or they just happen to have a home that they're trying to protect. It's a very difficult situation, in my opinion, to really resolve.
So do you think as IoT gets more and more prevalent, we'll just see more and more percentage of this 23 scanning?
Well, there are some activities to try to get better at this, but this particular problem isn't going away anytime soon. Yeah, as near as I can tell. We all need to have our thinking caps on about how to really take care of this. Similar situation in port 22 TCP, which is not nearly as significant, but there are certainly devices that are out there that are, it's brute force password guessing activities, looking for default passwords on systems and being able to gain access to it. This has been relatively stable, although over the last few weeks here, we did see an increase in the number of sources that are doing that scanning. It has not had a significant impact on the number of probes that are taking place. Those additional sources are doing it kind of low and slow, but nevertheless, over time, they have the opportunity to basically scan the entire internet and find all those devices. And I think a couple of weeks ago, I showed a similar graph to this one. This is basically the geographic distribution of those sources doing the port 22 scanning. If you were to take a satellite picture of the Earth and look where the lights are, it probably would look a lot like this. And so I think it's just, relatively even distribution. And, the one we showed a couple weeks ago was almost exactly the same, except it had about 500 less sources. So it's grown a little bit, but it's basically the same distribution.
I still want to know what those sources are out in the middle of the Indian Ocean.
Yeah, we were speculating about that. I don't know if that's just an error in the geographic mapping or if there, in fact, are little itsy-bitsy islands or somebody in a canoe. Okay, you never know. Next item, scan probes and sources on port 53413 UDP. Basically, we see a surge over the last few days in the number of probes, and these are technically not probes. They're really just scripts that are getting tossed out on this port, targeting Netis brand routers, which happen to have a backdoor on this port that allow you to throw a script at it and it'll execute it if you hit it. The number of sources has actually gone down, whereas the number of probes has gone up. Now, I could speculate about what that really means. That is, generally speaking, the number of probes basically indicates that there's recruiting activity going on. A decrease in the number of sources, perhaps somebody fixed something and it caused a decrease in the number of sources. We're just really looking at, in the bottom corner here where it's gone down a little bit. And in fact, over the last couple of weeks, it's gone down a little bit here. That may be that something got blocked, and maybe somebody blocked this port, and they no longer could access those devices, and so they're upping their recruiting activities a little bit. It's a little unclear what's going on. Nevertheless, if you have one of those devices, you're going to want to lock it down. So that's our show for today. I'd like to thank you for joining us, and if you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at attThreatTraq@list.att.com. You can find AT&T ThreatTraq on the AT&T Tech channel. It's on YouTube, as well as an audio podcast on iTunes. And you can follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @ATTBusiness. We'd like to thank you, Jim Clausing, for joining us today. Thank you, Joe Harten. Thank you, Michael Singer. I'm Brian Rexroad. We'll be back next week with a new episode, and until then, keep your network safe.